Welcome back to our last lecture on the taxonomy and characteristics of reptiles, where we're going to be focusing on snakes and lizards. At this point, you know the drill. We're going to be talking about some of the family characteristics, family habitats and habits, some general aspects of reproduction and development, very general diet, and then the geographic distribution, particularly with some of the species that inhabit Indiana. So as always, I'm going to shut my camera off so that we can take a look at some of these pictures. And we're going to first start talking about lizards. And so when we're thinking about Squamata, Squamata is the order where both lizards and snakes are housed. And collectively, there's about 8,000 species of Squamata that exist today. And within the group of lizards is the largest group. So there's about 5,000 species of lizards. They are the most abundant and diverse reptilian group that exists today. And in general, lizards have 4 legs and 5 toes each, but there are a few exceptions, and we're going to talk about some of those today. Those that do have 4 legs with 5 toes all have claws. Remember, lizards have movable eyelids. So here we have a snake with non-movable eyelids, no ear openings, and lizards have movable eyelids with an external ear opening. Now remember, salamanders are amphibians, they don't lack claws. So as I mentioned in our salamander lecture, oftentimes I get pictures from the general public where they confuse salamanders, which are amphibians, from our lizards. Obviously, lizards have scales, movable eyelids, and ear openings, but those claws and scales are really what separate the lizards from our amphibian counterparts, the salamanders. Lizards also have really long tails, and many species of lizards will autotomize their tail or lose their tail as a defense mechanism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We're not going to talk a lot about the different types of scales in lizards. I know those of you that are taking the lab with Courtney, you'll learn a few different types of scales, but really is important to note that the scale type, the scale size, and the arrangement of those scales are really important features that are oftentimes used to differentiate species of lizards that are oftentimes very similar in appearance. Now, with 5,000 species of lizards, the types of habits and habitats that they encounter are going to vary tremendously. Most lizards are terrestrial, but we do have some that are semi-aquatic, and most lizards are diurnal, which means they're active during the daylight hours. There are some, however, that are arboreal, and some are even that are fossorial, and we'll give you some examples of those as well. Again, with regard to reproduction and development, with 5,000 species, a lot of variation. The one thing they have in common is they all have internal fertilization, but with regard to how they reproduce, there's some that are oviparous, some that are viviparous, and some that are ovoviviparous. Some species of lizards have significant courtship, and I'll show you some videos later on in the semester of some of these really clever ways in which males try to attract females, usually through bright colorations, but also through different behaviors that they may exhibit to attract females' attention. Most species lay flexible or hard shells, which are deposited on the ground. Very little parental care with most of our lizards. Lizards in general are carnivorous, and they occur in all tropical and temperate regions of the world. Now, Indiana is actually not home to that many species of lizards. In fact, we only have 7, and one of those is a non-native species. So let's start talking about some of our lizard families. One that might be common to you are our Phrynosomatidae, which are spiny lizards. And the best example, the only example that we have in Indiana, is our northern fence lizard. They're called fence lizards because they're oftentimes seen on wooden fences or fence posts out basking in the sun. It's not uncommon for most species of lizards to bask between 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning till about 11 o'clock in the morning, get warmed up. They're very active foragers. They're oftentimes very quick moving, and they're so speedy so that they can go capture insects, which is generally their major prey item. But with regard to the family Phrynosomatidae, there's 125 species in this family. Again, we have one representative, the northern fence lizards, Colubridae undulatus. Members of this family contain lizards with a broad array of morphological features. So you can see here our Texas horned lizard with a really dorsal, ventrally flattened body and these prominent horns on their head are also members of this family. And this is a really, Phrynosoma is a large genus in the Southwest United States, is where a lot of this family exists. And again, we only have this single species. With regard to habitat, Squamates is by far the most common in Indiana. It includes a terrestrial form, but they're also in this family arboreal and rock-dwelling species, again, like the Phrynosoma in the desert Southwest. Most species of Phrynosomas are oviparous, but there are a few species that are viviparous. And they're found throughout most of the continental United States and all of Mexico and northern Central America. And as we start learning a little bit more about defensive behaviors in just a couple of lectures, there's some really interesting Phrynosoma behavior, anti-predator behaviors that I'll show you some videos. I mean, they're really interesting and bizarre, and I think you'll really enjoy watching those videos. A family you may not be familiar with is the family Anguidae. These are our glass or alligator lizards. And Indiana is actually home to one of our legless lizards, the western slender glass lizard, Ophiosaurus attenuatus. And so for those of you up near Fowler or in Otterburn and Benton in Fowler counties, or not Fowler, Newton County, the northwest part of the state, you may have encountered slender glass lizards, and oftentimes people think they're snakes, right? Because they lack legs. So these are legless lizards, but remember, legless lizards still have an external ear, snakes do not, and they have movable eyelids, snakes do not. So you see those two features, you know you have a lizard and not a snake. So the family Anguidae is home to about 120 species. All are very long and have shiny scales. Now these scales are underlined with bony plates called osteoderms, and it gives them a really stiff feel and a really shiny appearance. So those osteoderms are essentially bony armor that helps protect these long legless lizards. Like skinks, which we'll talk about here in a minute, they oftentimes will shed their tails, again, which is called autonomy, tail autonomy. And they're called glass lizards because you can't really see it very well in either one of these pictures, but the tails on these lizards are really about 2/3 to 3/4 of the length of the body. So this is the actual makes up the body, and about right here, all the rest of this will be tail. And if this particular animal is captured or threatened, it will autonomize or break off its tail right here, and the rest of this tail will writhe about and break into multiple pieces. So it's essentially sacrificing that lower portion of its tail so that the body can then slither off and the lizard can live another day, slither off and regenerate its tail, and no harm, no foul. So as you'd imagine with this particular lizard, they're highly terrestrial and semi-fossorial. So they spend a great deal of time in burrows underground. They're mostly oviparous, but there's some ovovivipary, and a few species are viviparous. All are carnivorous, eating arthropods and small vertebrates. In terms of distribution, North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. And again, we have the western slender glass lizard. It's a really cool lizard. If you ever get up to Northwest Indiana, into even up as far as the Indiana dunes, but certainly near the Nature Conservancy in Benton and Newton counties, those where you're going to find the largest populations of western slender glass lizards. A really cool lizard to try to capture and observe in nature. Let's move on to our family Teiidae. These are our whiptails and racerunners. 110 species in this family. Again, when you're looking at these lizards, they have pretty long, slender bodies with very well-developed limbs. Oftentimes, members will have yellow stripes on their body. Males tend to have a blue chest during the breeding season, or it can be green. The color varies with different species and subspecies. With a name like whiptails and racerunners, they're going to have really long, thin tails, again, which they also will autotomize. And with a name like racerunners, they are lightning fast, especially after about 11 o'clock in the morning when they've had a chance to bask in the sun. Almost impossible to catch with your hand. You almost have just to use a net. They are terrestrial and prefer sandy prairie areas. So again, that northwest part of Indiana, where we have our remnant prairies, or where you're largely going to find the Teiids, our prairie race runner or six-line race runner, Aspidosceles sexlineatus. Within this family, you're going to see ovipary. And something that's really unique is there's also some species within this family that are parthenogenic. And if you look in your Snakes and Lizards of Indiana textbook, that's a required text for this course, you'll see a great description of parthenogenesis, which is essentially where a female, the populations are all female, they're unisexual. So females will lay viable eggs, they're unfertilized, so they're 100% clonal replicates of the mother. So there are no males in the population. And that's found in the family Teiidae. Now, the prairie race runner and six-line race runner that we have in Indiana is a sexual species. It does not have that clonal parthenogenic mode of reproduction. So we don't have that in Indiana, but it is found in this family, and it is a term and a mode of reproduction that I want you to know. And again, it's called parthenogenesis, and it's found in your Snakes and Lizards of Indiana book. You can read about it and which families have it and how it works. Teiidae are found only in the New World, so only in North and South America. And again, we have these two subspecies, the prairie race runner and six-line race runner. The only difference between these two is one has a blue hue and one doesn't. Family that I suspect most of you are familiar with is the family Skinkidae. This is a huge lizard family. In fact, it's the largest of all the families of lizards. Over 1,200 species in this family. And these are the skinks. So skinks also have these osteoderms, so they often have really stiff bodies and also really shiny appearance. So the examples that we're showing you here on the slide are the five-line skink. So this is actually the same species. And I'm sure most of you have probably heard what people oftentimes call a blue-tailed skink. It's actually a five-line skink juvenile. And the tail's blue because skinks, much like the Anguidae, will autotomize their tail. And in juveniles, which are highly prone to predation, these tails are even colored blue to attract the predator's attention so that it may attack the blue portion, again, where the lizard will autotomize it right about here, and then it will writhe about on the ground, and the skink will then scurry off and regenerate its tail over the next season. Now, with a family with 1,200 species, you can imagine there's tremendous variation in their habit and habitat. We have species that are terrestrial, semi-fossorial, diurnal, all kinds of habitats that you can imagine are pretty much occupied by the skinks. Reproduction is also highly variable. Ovipary, ovovivipary, but most are viviparous. And they're, as juveniles and adults, they're largely insectivorous, and they occur on all continents except Antarctica. And we actually have 3 species of skinks. The five-line skink that you see on the slide, the little brown skink that's probably the size of a number 2 pencil, but only as long as your pinky finger. It really is a little brown skink. And we also have a broadhead skink that looks very similar to the five-line skink. So let's move into the second group of squamates, which are our snakes. And this is a group that probably fascinates or terrifies people mostly. There are 3,000 species of snakes that are currently extant on the planet. And obviously one of the most notable characteristics for this group of squamates are that they're legless. Again, but not completely unique to snakes because we just talked about the Anguidae, which are legless lizards. But all snakes have immovable eyelids. They do not have external ears. Instead, they have a sixth sense that is associated with the tongue flicking, and it's called a Jacobson's organ, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. Another interesting fact about snakes and this really long cylindrical body is that they oftentimes lack a left lung, and that's an adaptation to help keep the bodies as skinny and slender as possible so that they can be highly fossorial. So they oftentimes lack a left lung, or that left lung is highly degenerative. Now, similar to what we talked about with lizards, there are some species of snakes that can be very difficult to differentiate. And so the size of the scales, the shape of the scales, the arrangement of the scales are really important to help differentiate those similar species. But for purposes of this lecture, I'm not going to have you learn the different types of scales for the most part and use those for species identification, because we're focused on much bigger picture components of herpetology. Again, with 3,000 species, a wide range of habitats ranging from terrestrial, arboreal, fossorial to aquatic. In warm regions, snakes are active year-round, but they do become dormant in periods of cold weather like we have here in Indiana that we're just about ready to move into late fall and early winter, and a lot of our snakes are actually seeking underground refugia right now so that they don't freeze. And those are called hibernacula. With regard to reproduction and development, most snakes are oviparous, so they lay shelled eggs, but they can be ovoviviparous or totally viviparous. All snakes are carnivorous, but the methods of killing and obtaining their prey are highly variable. Some snakes will simply grab them and consume them whole. Other snakes will first constrict them and then consume them. Other species will bite them and inject a venom, chase the animal down, find it when it's deceased or at least paralyzed, and then ingest the animal. Some species of snakes have specialized jawbones that can allow them to swallow prey that are many times wider or larger diameter than the snake's head and body. And I'll show you some videos of that as well. In terms of distribution, they're found in temperate and tropical parts of the world, all continents, much like our lizards, except Antarctica. Indiana is actually home to quite a few species of snakes, and 4 of those species are actually venomous. And that's the first family that we're going to talk about, our family Viperidae. And these are our pit vipers. There are 215 species of pit vipers, and we have 4 species of pit vipers in Indiana. And all of these are considered endangered. All are venomous, and they have really long hinged fangs, and their venom is a hemotoxin. So you're oftentimes going to hear hemotoxin versus neurotoxin. Well, venoms in general are a really potent mix of about 150 different enzymes and proteins. But with the pit vipers, those proteins are largely hemotoxic in form, which means they attack the heme groups of your blood. So you can think about a hemotoxin as an early way to start digesting flesh or tissue. So when you get envenomated by a viperid or a viper, you oftentimes will see a lot of edema, a lot of swelling, and you'll see a lot of hemorrhaging, because the venom is actually starting to break down and cause necrosis of that actual tissue. Whereas a neurotoxin, what you see in our cobras and those types of species, oftentimes affects your central nervous system. So it will cause a sudden cessation of your heart, or your lungs will stop functioning, or your diaphragm will no longer work. And so oftentimes you die as a result of that, and you don't have the accompanying swelling and necrosis that you do with our hemotoxin. Now, that's not to say that our vipers don't have a little bit of neurotoxic properties, but primarily hemotoxin. So let's talk about their fangs. Again, they have really large fangs, and some members of the viperids have fangs that are 2 inches in length. And so they're so long, and in fact, that most of the time they're hinged, and those fangs lie folded against the roof of the mouth. And when the snake opens the mouth, those fangs will drop down like hypodermic needles, and they're hollow down to the tip, and so it allows the venom to travel down a tube through those hollowed fangs and be used as syringes to inject venom deep into the flesh. Vipers typically have very broad heads and really stocky bodies, and they're called pit vipers. And I don't have a great picture here, but we'll talk about it in a couple of subsequent lectures. But there's the eye, there's the nostril, and there's that pit that gives this particular family its name, the pit vipers. And this is called a loreal pit, L-O-R-E-A-L, loreal pit. And it's essentially a pit organ that allows these snakes to sense heat through these facial pits. Essentially gives them a thermal picture of the animal, even in complete darkness. So these particular species oftentimes feed on animals that have very warm blood. So it could be a homeotherm like a squirrel or a chipmunk, or it could be another reptile that just happens to be really warm from being warmed up by the sun. But they use those heat-seeking pits as a way to detect their prey. In terms of habits and habitat, they're terrestrial with a wide variety of habitats, from deserts to sand dunes to even some species like our eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, which is actually a wetland species of rattlesnake. In terms of reproduction, they're mostly viviparous. That's a pretty common characteristic with these viperids. Diet, they're carnivorous, and again, they will bite and inject venom, and then pursue those animals when they become paralyzed and incapacitated and swallow them whole. Geographic distribution throughout most of North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and Asia. You don't find viperids in Australia. Those are dominated by our elapids, things like brown snakes and cobras. In Indiana, we have 4 species of viperids. We have our northern copperhead, our western cottonmouth, our eastern Massasauga, and our timber rattlesnake. Again, all of those are listed as endangered. They are not very common. So let's move on to another pretty common group. This is our family Colubridae. This used to be a really large family of snakes, but over the last 5 or 6 years, it's been broken down and different members of the genera have actually been elevated into new families. So now it's about 650 species, where historically it was 2,000 species. So around 600 or 700 species of colubrids. So it still remains a pretty large family of diverse, different animals. The snakes in this group can be small, so 7 inches in size, all the way up to 12 feet in length. And they vary from aquatic habitats to terrestrial habitats, all the way to some really arid areas as well. Reproduction and development, you see a lot of ovipary and sometimes ovovivipary. Diet, they're carnivorous, and we have quite a few species of colubrids. Here we have our western fox snake, which is really common in Tippecanoe County, and this is a blue racer down that we found in southwest Indiana. And I'm wearing gloves. Blue racers have a reputation of being a bitey snake, and so they're pretty cranky. And so I was actually doing a program with a bunch of landowners about the importance of snakes in ecosystems and trying to get landowners to not persecute snakes. And this particular snake kept biting me, so I had to put gloves on because my hands were bleeding profusely underneath these gloves, and I didn't want the landowners to see the snake biting me repeatedly and me bleeding in front of them, because that might make the message I was trying to deliver a little harder for them to digest. So that particular snake was pretty cranky. What about the family Natricidae? Many members of this family, there's about 200 species, are diverse. Most are somewhat affiliated with aquatic environments. It's not uncommon to find some that are more terrestrial or even fossorial, but most of them are tied to water, or at least wet environments. Most of the species are viviparous. All of the ones here in the US are, while many of the old world are oviparous. They're carnivorous like most species, and again, some of the species that we have, the most common is our northern water snake. That's the #1 snake I get calls about. Every northern water snake that someone sees, they almost always think it's a cottonmouth or a copperhead or a rattlesnake, when in fact it's just a northern water snake. But they're pretty aggressive snakes, and that causes people to be pretty nervous. And so I get lots of calls and pictures sent to me to identify those snakes. We have a couple of endangered species in this family, the red-bellied water snake or copper-bellied water snake, as well as the Kirtland snake, which is actually pretty common around in Indianapolis because it does really well in the areas where there's a lot of trash. And so a lot of the old abandoned places that people leave refuse behind is a good place to go and try to find Kirtland snakes. Our next to last family is our Dipsadidae. About 700 species in this family of small to medium-sized snakes. Most members of this family are secretive and hide beneath cover objects. So here you can see a northern ringneck snake, which is a relatively small snake. This is actually an adult, and a little bit larger eastern hognose snake. Most species in this family are oviparous, and their diets are diverse and range from invertebrates, which you're going to see this northern ringneck snake eat, all the way up to amphibians. And that's what this eastern hognose snake, and you can see why it's called a hognose snake. It's got an upturned rostral snout or scale on its snout, which specializes in toads. All living representatives of this family are endemic to the New World, which means they're only found in the New World. And the eastern hognose snake is actually one of my favorite species of snakes. And I wanted to share an excerpt with you from the book entitled Amphibians and Reptiles of the Great Lakes Region, which was written by Jim Harding, who's a friend of mine up in Michigan. And the eastern hognose snake is a species that I call the most theatrical reptile that exists. And let me share some narrative with you from the species account that Jim Harding wrote in his book, describing the theatrical behavior of the eastern hognose snake. An alarmed hognose snake will raise its head and neck, slowly flick its oversized tongue in and out, and inhale deeply while flattening its head and neck into a cobra-like hood. And that's what you're seeing in this picture here. The dark neck blotches suddenly become quite conspicuous, perhaps resembling large eyes to a predator. The snake then exhales slowly, producing a series of loud hisses, and may strike at the presumed enemy, though most often with the mouth closed. The tail may be repeatedly coiled and uncoiled, and odorous anal secretions and feces are often smeared over the snake's body. If the snake continues to be harassed or physically attacked, it may then go into convulsions and show signs of extreme distress, writhing violently, dragging its everted cloaca and open mouth in the dirt, and sometimes vomiting its last meal. Eventually, its writhing movements slow. It turns upside down, lying limp with mouth open, covered in dirt and musk and feces, and looking and smelling thoroughly disgusting and quite dead. If at this point the snake is turned right side up, however, it belies its supposed death by promptly twisting onto its back once more. Once the enemy leaves, the snake eventually raises its head, flicks its tongue, and goes on its way. So that's always just a fun little narrative, again, from the book, Amphibians and Reptiles of the Great Lakes Region. I just think that's a really poetic way to describe the eastern hognose snake. And we do have those in Indiana, or here in Tippecanoe County. And so I encourage you, if you ever do see an eastern hognose snake and you can properly identify it, see if you could get it to perform some of the theatrical traits that we just learned about by Jim Harding. So with that, that concludes the lecture on the taxonomy of extant reptiles, both chelonians as well as our lizards and our snakes, and hopefully you'll read the textbooks that we have for you and learn about some really interesting natural history of these really cool groups. So the next time we talk, we'll be talking about the energetics and metabolism, the exothermic life. We'll see you then.